The author of the Star Chamber of Stanford University. Rony is a philosopher and an attorney, and you've been following these campus protests, usually on the pro-Palestine, anti-Israel direction. What's coming up for you? What are your initial thoughts?
I think what's most striking is the histrionic responses on the part of the protesters' critics. Now, I would have plenty to say in criticism of what I believe to be most of these protesters' ideology, but this idea that they're the manifestations of burgeoning anti-Semitism. I've seen precious little evidence for that. Listening to all sorts of pundits. There's I've heard one remark. I guess it was outside of Columbia, so presumably maybe not even by a student. Go back to Poland. I think there's very little there, and I think that many people have observed this, and critics have observed this. They said, well, this is motivated by your DEI woke ideology, where anything which is associated with whiteness is condemned, and Israel is associated with whiteness, and that's why they're saying what they're saying. And I think that's a lot closer to the truth. Whatever the truth may be, that's a lot closer to the truth than anti-Semitism. I think that had there been this latent anti-Semitism, then students at schools like Columbia and UCLA would have noticed all sorts of other manifestations before October 7th, but I don't think there were many complaints about it. So that's my general view of the interpretations. People think this is 1930s Germany, all sorts of pretty ridiculous things.
Yeah, I mean, there isn't even one example of a Jewish student getting seriously beaten up. So for me, as long as it doesn't turn to violence, then it's not chilling. It's not earth-shattering. I mean, there's so much criminal violence in our country already. The other disturbing thing about the reaction to these protests is how eager Republican politicians in particular are to criminalize anti-Israel speech and classify it as anti-Semitic, and the House of Representatives passed some bill to protect Jews by trying to criminalize different types of anti-Israel speech. So I think that's
right. Well,
disturbing.
So you're talking about what the Anti-Semitism Awareness and Education Act or something like that. So basically, it's not a criminal statute, but what would happen is that you have certain political views are built into the definition of anti-Semitism. So, for example, if you had a school and you had, all these students who are, harassing the Jewish student, calling him a dirty Jew, and the school, did nothing to interfere, they would be liable to, lawsuits and maybe the cutting off of federal funding. And essentially what this bill is saying is that certain criticisms of the philosophical foundations of Israel, or comparisons with the IDF with the Nazis, which are obviously protected First Amendment speech, that becomes the legal equivalent of saying dirty Jew.
Yeah.
So I don't think that would I certainly don't think it passes constitutional muster, and if it does pass the Senate, then I would expect it to be struck down by the courts. But who knows these days.
So I heard John Mearsheimer, co-author of the book The Israel Lobby, he argued in a recent live stream that the pro-Israel crowd is the greatest threat to free speech in America. What do you think about that idea?
I mean, I guess he is. I guess he's taking some bruises himself after writing the Israel Lobby. And I think to the extent that he's responding to his own academic ostracism. I wouldn't equate mere academic ostracism with abrogation of free speech. But yeah, in the same way that I think it's no longer possible for conservatives to get out there and say, we believe in a traditional sexual morality, traditional values of decorum and so forth after Donald Trump. At that point, nobody can really take that seriously anymore. And I think it's kind of going to be the same thing with free speech and the right wing, where you know uh, they would get all worked up if some commencement speaker was disinvited after there was outcry after something they said, which is clearly really only very tangentially a free speech issue to my mind. But yeah, here you are asking for actual legal penalties for speech, which is much more serious. But of course, that's been going on for a while with anti BDS bills, where if you're employed by or contract with certain states, you have to promise not to boycott Israel. That's clearly unconstitutional. Though I think most of those laws have been struck down, but I do think they may have occasionally survived. So yeah, on a rigorous, strict definition of what free speech is, of what the abrogation of free speech is, which is actual imposition of legal penalties by the state. Um, how much of a threat they're going to be, it may still be a little too early to say, but I can't think of a greater potential threat. That's
Now,
just there.
yeah, I've been walking around UCLA covering these protests. UCLA has hosted the most vigorous anti-protest, counter-protests,
Right.
and I've never once felt unsafe or singled out for any kind of anti-Jewish hostility. So I've been around the pro-Palestine crowd. I mean, I've been to dueling protests where there are 1,000 very angry people on both
Right.
sides, but I never felt singled out. And there are a considerable number of Jews on the side of the protesters. I don't know. I think a third of American Jews care intensely about Israel, a third care mildly, and another third don't really care at all. So does that breakdown of American Jewry sound about right to you?
Um, it's really hard to say. I'm not a pollster, and I haven't kept track with polls, so it doesn't sound implausible to me. But I can't really verify that. But I did not go up to Columbia here to get the vibes. But your sense of things is pretty much uh how thought it would be. And yeah, it's misrepresented on the media. Like they'll say these pro-Palestine protesters are blocking Jewish students from getting to their classes. So there's always the insinuation that they have like pre-identified people, certain people as Jews, even though that's not literally being said. Yeah, they may block certain students from going down certain pathways, and some of them are Jewish. So the statement, it's technically true, but clearly misleading in its undertones. And yeah, but so there's a lot of disingenuous framing that way. It seems to me like in reality, what's going on is they took over certain areas, and they don't want the counter protesters to invade their space. So maybe they keep out people whom they deem to be counter protesters. But that's not like, oh, let's go find a Jew. Let's find out where they're trying to go. They're trying to go to the library. Let's stop them from going there. They say, well, these are like disruptive protests. But it seems to me like my sense is that the maximum disruption that they're causing is, oh, you wanted to play frisbee on this field here, but now you have to go on this side of the quad instead. Or you wanted to walk this way to get to the library, and now you got to do a 100-yard detour. I don't think that my sense is that there's not much more disruptive than that. Of course, with exceptions, when they took out they took over the building at Hamilton Hall at Columbia, and obviously the violence by the counter protesters, most notably at UCLA.
Now, you've spent a considerable amount of time in academia. What was your experience of anti-Semitism?
Well, whether it be academia or the U.S. Generally, I have experienced extremely little anti-Semitism in the U.S. Now, you can say maybe that's because of where I've lived, but I've lived a lot of time in Columbus, Ohio, in Bloomington, Indiana. So not, which is a college town, but yeah, I mean, I can count on. I need less than 5 fingers to, in my entire lifetime, to recount anti-Semitic incidents, and they were really just two, and they were both, quite trivial. So I've never internalized this idea there's a serious anti-Semitism problem, in the U.S. Obviously, you've got the fringe and so forth, but just among ordinary people, whether it be in academia or elsewhere, I really haven't felt very much of it at all.
Now, Jews who don't care for having a Jewish state, Jews who, for example, are more left-wing, then they put their political ideology before their Jewish identity or identity with the Jewish state, they are not going to be happy with the Jewish state. So this is a significant number of Jews who do not care for, in particular, Bibi Netanyahu, the current Israeli government, and don't care for having an explicitly Jewish state. Most Jews probably have a positive predilection towards Zionism in America anyway, but a significant number of Jews don't, and I certainly don't think it's any kind of self-hating thing that's primarily going on. It's just that people have a hierarchy of values. And for some people, the idea of any sort of ethnic state just strikes them as repugnant. So how's your understanding of, say, Jews who are joining these pro-Palestine protests, Jews who are appalled by the behavior of the Jewish state?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's hard to equate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism when, Zionism, at the beginning when it first emerged. I mean, first of all, it emerged with Christian Zionists before Jews, and it was considered, heresy and blasphemy to think that Israel can be restored politically through some sort of human agency, as opposed to waiting for messianic redemption. So that was always the Orthodox view of the Jewish people's relationship to Israel. This idea, which is put forth, for 2,000 years, the only thing people were clamoring for was a resurrection of Israel. I think is false. Now, it's a little bit different today because in Israel, certainly the Orthodox practice of Judaism has certainly come to accommodate Zionism to a much greater extent than before. But historically speaking, Zionism is a heresy. So yeah, quite ironic to equate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. As far as the Jews who say we don't want an ethnic state. Okay, philosophically, I can grant them that, and philosophically, the pro-Palestinian side may win on a number of points as to the ethno-state, as to the idea that after 2,000 years, because you have this ancestral connection to this land, that you retain any kind of legal or political claim. That's certainly not a principle which we would accept in most other contexts. So theoretically, I don't dismiss it. I think any worthwhile prescription has to be grounded in some sort of realistic appreciation of the world as it is today, and regardless of your your underlying theory. At this point, you have an Israel and you have an Israeli culture, and maybe we don't like even if you don't like the ethnogenesis of that culture, it is there, and I certainly understand that no one in Israel, even the most left wing, is going to agree to a one state solution where they become overwhelmed by this other ethnic group. And you can say that's sort of deeply racist, but I would think, let's say if Spain marched into Portugal and tried to take over, Portugal, and even if all the former Portuguese were given full rights, equal rights with the Spanish in the Spanish states, they would still have a basis for resentment. They would still say, "Well, this is just not my society anymore," and it doesn't even need to be based on some strong ethnic identity. It's just it would be a radical transformation of the conditions of life, and even more so in Israel. I think any kind of one state solution would breed endless conflict. I don't think it would be good for everyone. So yeah, I don't fault the protesters philosophically if that's their position. But I might fault some of them for not reckoning with a lot of the realities and the practicalities of Israel as it is today.
Now, why do you think that there was such a firm and relatively swift crackdown on these campus protests, as opposed to the last time we had protests this big, which were really the 1960s over Vietnam? I would offer to you the primary reason for the relatively swift crackdown on these encampments and keeping these protests from taking over halls at universities is because there are a sizable and influential number of billionaire Jewish donors to universities, and these universities don't want to upset this major source of their funding.
Yeah, I mean that's certainly a big part of it. No question. The president of Columbia saw what happened to the presidents of Harvard and Penn, and she wanted to keep her head. And I mean, these threats of withholding money are explicitly made. The primary job of a university president is to raise money. So if they can't do that, if their ability to raise money is hampered, well, their career is going to get cut short. So yeah, I think that yeah, of course, it's phrased in terms of, oh, we've got to balance free speech and like keeping Jewish students feeling safe. But yeah, I think the donors are a big part of it. There's also what the Republicans in Congress might do in terms of funding. That's part of it as well. But yeah, I think it's those two things. I mean, we see it right before us. We see the threats of withholding donations is made, and then action is taken. So yeah, that's the most plausible explanation.
Now, on the other hand, I don't think of these crackdowns as restricting student speech. All right, if you remove students who've occupied a campus building, I don't see that as primarily a matter of free speech. If you remove an encampment, where at UCLA they took up central territory at UCLA and they prevented many students from passing if they did not identify as anti-Zionist or non-Zionist. So Zionists would have to take a different route. They'd be denied access to one of the undergraduate library at UCLA. So I think as soon as you deny access to the normal operation of the university on ideological grounds, I would side with cracking down on such encampments and such disruptions of university life. I would side with sending in the police if students occupy campus buildings and so prevent the normal functioning of the university. And I do not see that as a free speech issue. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with that. So we've got to look at degrees. Obviously, if you take over a building, that's clearly entitled to no protection. Yeah, if you are trying to restrict people's movements intentionally, you're trying to inconvenience them from getting to a library because they are are Zionist. I agree. That's not entitled to protection. If you are, inconveniencing people because your encampment causes people to do 100-yard detour, that kind of thing, I think that's sufficiently trivial that I wouldn't, even though, you could say, yeah, technically, people have the right to use any path they want. That's technically true, but to the extent that the inconvenience is trivial, I wouldn't seize on that as a pretext for a crackdown. What if you have an encampment and there are counter protesters, and you don't want to let the counter protesters come into the middle of your encampment and start screaming at you there? Is that okay? Well, on one level, I would say no. I mean, you can be out here to say what you want, but they want to come here and confront you on public space. They have the right to as well. On the other hand, it is kind of part of an assembly. You want to have a bunch of people together to send this message. That's a form of expression as well, which is kind of diluted if you have a counter protest growing right in the middle of your encampment. That is kind of borderline, certainly not as objectionable as keeping people from going to a building because of what they believe. So, it's a matter of degree. That's often the case with the First Amendment. But if it's just letting people keep their tents there, even though there is a general rule, no overnight camping on the quad. So you can, the schools can say, well, we're enforcing that. It has nothing to do with ideology. This is a general rule which applies to anyone, no matter what they have to say. Yeah, I guess technically they can do that constitutionally, though I think that, if you are presumably committed to free speech as an institutional value, then it's advisable not to, even though it's legally permissible.
Right. People don't have a right to set up encampments on public land,
Yeah.
particularly for hot button ideological reasons. The UCLA chancellor, in his testimony to Congress last week, says the thing that he primarily regrets is that he did not send police in right away to tear down the encampment. It is a disruption. Like, no, I would use the analysis to a private business. No private business would permit outsiders setting up an encampment on their private property to push an ideological perspective. And
Right.
whatever the ideology was, I would not want to sanction it setting up an encampment on public space. It's an eyesore, it's disruptive, and it raises tensions. And when you raise tensions, you increase the odds that someone will get hurt. And so I guess I have a broken windows policing attitude to this. You gotta stop the encampments. You've got to stop the takeover of public space, because if you don't stop it, then you are setting a trend towards the steady erosion of propriety. And so if someone is a broken windows policing advocate, meaning that as soon as there's a broken window, you've got to fix it right away, you've got to retain public order, then if you're a broken windows policing advocate, then you would believe in stopping the encampments as soon as they go up.
Yeah, well, they can do that at Columbia because it's a private school. I think someplace like UCLA is more complicated. So even if the restriction on free speech isn't based on the viewpoint, even if it's just time, place, manner restrictions, hey, we want to keep the quad looking a certain way, we want to have a certain atmosphere here at the school. This is kind of annoying. The bar. I think the bar has to be in a public space, which is governed by the First Amendment. I think it'd be hard to apply the broken windows theory, because to the extent you restrict free speech, even if it's in a viewpoint neutral way, you still have to show, a substantial state interest and in doing that. And the general view that minor disorder is going to breed greater disorder, I don't think you can invoke that in any context where the First Amendment hold sway precisely because it presents a slippery slope to the abuse of state power. Now that doesn't mean the broken windows theory of crime is wrong generally. I don't really have any firm thoughts on that, but I think there are restrictions on our ability to impose some analog of that wherever the First Amendment is relevant.
Right, but you don't. One does not have a right to set up an encampment on public property.
Yeah, that is true. Um, I yeah, how you would draw the line exactly um is more complicated. What if there was some rule that you can, where do you draw the line? I guess you could say putting up tents is a pretty clear line.
Yeah.
So again, I would just reiterate something I said before, that okay, even if constitutionally it was permissible, a school which is ostensibly committed to free exchange should probably be somewhat more tolerant than it absolutely has to as a legal matter. I mean, certainly, Columbia University, they in their brochures, they celebrate the history of radicalism at Columbia and the building takeovers in 1968, which I think were longer and more violent. So you sort of there's sort of an implicit understanding that you've cultivated with your students, which I think, again, even it's legally they can do whatever they want to do, but they should probably hesitate on that front. Is what I think.
Right, stated values are rarely real values. Like if a
Yeah,
corporation says we stand for X, it has absolutely nothing to
yeah,
do with that they
sure.
really stand for X. And so celebrating riots from 50 years ago doesn't mean that a university is going to celebrate them today.
Right.
And so almost never do people or institutions mean what they say.
That's right. That's right. But of course they can't. Columbia can't make that argument. You can make that argument on Columbia's behalf, but Columbia can't say we're hypocrites. So they have to live with the rhetorical constraints created by their hypocrisy.
John Mearsheimer notes that university campuses tend to be unfriendly to nationalism. It's not a perspective on life that is generally celebrated on university campuses. And he also notes that American university campuses tend to be the least pro-Israel parts of the United States. So there's no major pundit working in the mainstream media who's opposed to the existence of a Jewish state. So in the mainstream media, you've had a somewhat sanitized discourse where all sorts of perspectives that are taken for granted in Europe are not part of the American discourse. But on university campuses, Zionism is controversial even before these protests. Nationalism is generally looked down upon as barbaric and medieval. And the general ethos of a university campus is that we've risen above these primitive notions, that we have entered into the buffered identity where we're not tied down to these traditional ties to blood and soil nationalism. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think they think that though they'll certainly make allowances to the nationalism of the oppressed, right? So
Yeah.
and even the ideological excesses of the oppressed. And I think that the reason they'll invoke that double standards, well, they'll say if you look at Palestinian forms of nationalism, even malignant forms of Palestinian nationalism are ultimately a response to conditions of oppression, whereas the nationalism of the victors, of the powerful, is malignant because it's just a self-sustaining force. It's not in any way tied to the correction of some injustice. And I think that's why the in the early days leftists were a lot more sympathetic to Zionism than is the case than later became the case, precisely because there was a change in Israel's power relative to other countries, but also because Israeli nationalism objectively became much more malignant than it once was. I mean, of course, on the pro-Palestinian side, they're going to say, well, the seeds of fascism were always there, latent in Zionism. Maybe that was constrained for a time by left-wing labor Zionism, but it was always there in one degree or another. Even the most left-wing Zionists spoke of transferring Palestinians. So yeah, I mean, nationalism, it's antithetical to the cosmopolitan ideals of the buffered identity. It's this primitive atavism, and it is justified only to the extent it can be understood as a response to some kind of injustice.
So your smartest, most accomplished university professors, particularly at the elite universities, are they more or less likely than your average professor to be woke?
To be what?
To be woke.
Woke. I would be. I think you might find differences between various fields, between various departments. I'm not certain that you would find. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe somebody has done the study. But when you go down the university rankings, I still think like you're going to have more or less the same attitudes among the professoriate. Regardless of the average SAT that a student needs to get in there. Because even at middling or so so schools, most of the professors went to elite or semi-elite schools anyways. So unless the middling university is a conservative or religious in nature, there's something special about it. I would be surprised if there was a huge difference based on the prestige of the school. That's my maybe somebody has studied that, but that's my gut.
Would it be fair to call Barbara Fried woke?
Yeah, I think so. Not in the not in the performative sense. She wasn't, I mean, certainly, she and Joe, they certainly hated Republicans and all that. But there wasn't much performative moralizing coming from them. They weren't they're not those kinds of people. But if you were to look at the substance of Barbara's views, after the whole SBF debacle emerged, she was taken to task for having written some articles condemning the idea of personal responsibility as antiquated, anti-scientific. And so that idea, the complete rejection of personal responsibility as a atavistic notion, I would consider that to be woke, and that's very much something that she believes in. So on that theoretical level, yes, but I don't know that they were. I wouldn't say they were woke in the sense lamented by conservatives, meaning moralistic and preening and so forth. They weren't like that.
Right, and they secured for you a fellowship on the basis of your critique of liberalism. So
yeah,
I would think just on that basis alone, it would not be fair to call them woke.
That's true. Yeah, they weren't woke. On the other hand, part of what facilitated that is that, sort of at the end of the day, and I write about this, they had this sense like, at the end of the day, he's one of our people, you know, even if he has some sort of intellectual interest and or intellectual sympathy with these conservative critiques, he's still our kind of person, which is kind of in a sense true. I was coming at it from an intellectual viewpoint. What if instead I'd been someone who went to some evangelical college, a born again Christian, truly thought homosexuality was wrong, and abortion should be banned. I was like one of those kinds of people, and I had slipped into their classes, and I was a true believer. In that for that they would have been, I think, a lot less, receptive, even if they discerned the same level of intellectual promise. So, yeah, they weren't dogmatic, but certainly their openness was facilitated by what they correctly discerned to be my ironic distance from these ideas with which I was toying. So, but I guess that's just to say they're humans. There's a limit. I do think they would have had a more viscerally negative reaction to somebody whom they really felt was culturally right wing in their bones. That I think is there.
So there's a celebration of Black identity on university campuses, Latinx identity, gay identity, various third world nationalisms. And I think what underlies this celebration of these minority identities is a recognition that that these groups deserve dignity. Is that fair?
I think so. I mean, at its unobjectionable core, that is the case, but it's what grows out of that that's potentially problematic. But yeah, I mean, at that abstract level, no one opposes that. But conservatives will say, but it's never actually applied that abstractly. In reality, it's part of a power competition which can't be reduced to respect for dignity.
Well, how much are conservative claims of cultural oppression a plea for dignity?
Yeah, they are. I mean, certainly, there is, a kind of conservaphobia, which I just sort of discussed, I guess, when I described how Barbara and Joe, even though they were sort of open to my ideas intellectually, would have had a kind of a certain visceral reaction to conservatives. And I mean, that's just any kind any society has its your inside and your outside, and a certain range, not just of ideas but of temperaments, characters, ways of being that are outside the pale. And to the extent that you viscerally reject modernity, so I'm talking about kind of a conservative in the traditionalist sense, not just lower my tax rate, please, but a more full-bodied conservatism. I mean, you're rejecting modernity. So people who identify with modernity, it's not a kind of gratuitous bigotry. It's I say this is just sort of a structural entailment of the buffered identity. You have a certain view of what a human being is supposed to be like, a certain degree of distance from inherited values, a certain reflexivity, which you see as part of what it means to be a fully functioning human being. And then you see there are other people who, at least you perceive, do not embrace that. There's going to be a kind of visceral rejection on some level, and it's going to manifest itself in a certain way. But that's what makes conservative claims of cultural oppression interesting, because yes, they are a certain demand for dignity. They also illustrate the limits of that demand, because the kind of respect that we can extend to others uh, is intertwined with the nature of our own identities. And so demanding a certain kind of respect is, in a way, itself could be an act of violence, because you're saying you need to change your identity so that you're capable of affording me the kind of respect I think I deserve, which you're not able to do within the present configuration of your identity. I'm writing. I'm trying to put together an article um, comparing fat acceptance and COVID vaccine skepticism, because these are like you've got these are movements, one of the right and one of the left, that are both very wary of the established medical consensus and see it as a sort of a tool of oppression. But liberals are, even though they both reject established science, liberals are a lot more indulgent of fat acceptance activists than they are of COVID skeptics or COVID vaccine conspiracy theorists. Even though they're both equally irrational in some ways. So our cultural predispositions are going to filter in.
I'm wondering how much affirmative action plays a role in these pro-Palestine debates, in that if you needed affirmative action to get into a university, you are more likely than average to be struggling to keep up with a workload and to be able to blow off your insecurity, your frustration, your inability to perform at an expected level. You're going to be looking for some kind of outlet to offload your anxiety and insecurity, and put the blame at the feet of the institution. And so whether it's pro-Palestine protests or any of the protests that tend to flow across American university campuses, when I see them, they do seem to be disproportionately dominated by the less serious students. So I don't think I'm seeing a lot of engineering students by and large. I don't see many Asian students at these pro-Palestine protests.
Mm-hmm.
I think that if you're struggling to keep up because you got into university on the basis of affirmative action, and now you're struggling to keep up with the workload, it's a lot easier to say the institution's to blame for my troubles than to say, I'm struggling because I'm just not competent enough to do this work.
Yeah, that could be. I mean, I don't know. Look, obviously, the engineers are typically going to be more apolitical than the humanities and social science majors. And I guess I mean, the very elite schools, even though they have affirmative action. I mean, typically, even like the worst students are not so bad. Though, there were a few years where like Columbia and all these elite schools, they got rid of the SAT initially during COVID. I didn't get rid of the SAT, but it was voluntary. And now a lot of them are retrenching because they found that students who did not submit SAT scores performed markedly worse than those who did. But right now, yeah, you may have several classes of people who got in there solely on the basis of grades, which can be pretty meaningless without any kind of objective testing. I don't know. I mean, that's been said, for a while, that identity politics, minority students, I guess it would be primarily Black students and Hispanics. They got some leeway in the application process, so they're ill prepared, and then they need to vent their frustration in some way. I don't know whether that to the extent it's true, I'm not sure how much that can be applied to the current the context of the pro-Palestine uh, protests. I mean, certainly my impression. I mean, they seem to be degrading themselves. When you have like one of them, like this kind of what seems like this robotic chanting. Like you have like the leader of the pack, and they say something, and then everybody kind of repeats wholesale. Yeah, I mean that definitely seems problematic. It's not very intellectually serious. I saw there was this one thing in New York. This was at CUNY, so not an elite school, but you've got these students that are going after. There's just this CUNY cop. He's just like monitoring the area. He's not really doing anything problematic. They're like, but maybe he's not going to let them do everything they want to do. Maybe he's not going to let them go everywhere they want to go. And he's like, they go, "Oh, you're a genocide supporter." Like these kids, these 18-year-old kids yelling at him, "You're a genocide supporter." And he goes back, "Yeah, I want to kill all of you." And then the guy got suspended, you know, even though, I mean, look, it's intemperate language.
Yeah.
Obviously, uh, we expect more of a cop. I understand that, but I mean, these are real brats. It's just some dude. It's his job. We don't really know much about him. He hasn't actually done anything objectionable, and so you perceive that he's not on your side. So he's a genocide supporter. I mean that certainly reveals something about the left's capacity to alienate ordinary Americans. It's precisely that kind of thing. So yeah, I mean, look, these kinds of hard left positions that are more moralistic than intellectual. At a minimum, yeah, it's going to attract people with very puritanical, very absolutist moral senses. Yeah, they're not going to be interested in nuance. Of course, they're going to say, "Well, to hell with your nuance when you have all these Palestinian children dying." I understand that, but I still think that there's something about their temperament as well that's at play.
And how much do you think is underlying these pro-Palestine protests is again another plea for dignity? I think that's what's driving these protests along with most campus protests. It's a sense that the pro-Palestine sympathizers just don't feel respected and don't feel like that America respects them and appreciates them.
Yeah, I mean, look, they are seen. I mean, that's there's no question that this whole Israel, even though it disclaims colonialism now, certainly the original Zionists did see it as a colonial project, among other things as well. And yeah, so a lot of these students, they're darker skinned. They're not necessarily Palestinian, not necessarily Arab, but they come from what is proverbially called the global South. And yeah, they see the U.S. attitudes towards the Palestinians, what they consider to be the double standards, the leniency towards Israel, as a form of tacit contempt for people who are like them. I mean, you had which is going on, which is kind of true, not of every individual leader, but it's certainly in the air. There was that thing. I think it was University of North Carolina or South Carolina. It was one of those. And you had like a few black students who just came out. There's a couple of them. They were just doing like a pro-Palestine speech, some slogans, some signs. And then like it provoked like a groundswell of all these white frat boys like going out there and just like yelling at them and calling them names and making monkey noises and so forth. Now, what were they thinking? Were they really such ardent Zionists? I don't think in that school there were all that many Jews. Some of them, probably given that it was the South, you probably had a fair number of evangelicals who were ideologically pro-Zionist for religious reasons. But I think, beyond that, it's pretty much, they saw, even though the protesters were attacking Israel, they saw it as an attack on the United States and an attack on their identities, precisely because, in their minds they have coded, Israel as more white, more Western, more like them. And so that's going to be kind of the lens, through which a lot of Americans perceive that. And so naturally, you've got a lot of, I guess, students of color, for lack of a better word, lack of a better term, who are going to see this as about a lot more than just the specifics of the Israel-Palestinian conflict. It is a metaphor for uh, for everything else, right? It's the same thing in the U.S. The 1619 Project, the dispossession of the Native Americans. It's just like another forum. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is like just another forum for the same underlying debate, and that's why dignity is implicated.
And I wouldn't think that people who feel lacking in dignity are going to be that happy. On the other hand, I think that people who are happy are going to be much less likely to take part in these protests. If you are thriving on a campus, whether it's thriving in extracurricular activities, you're a star on the football team or in theater, or you're a star reporter for the campus newspaper, or you are a star in your electronic engineering program, if you're high achieving, if you're just a social star, you're enjoying a vibrant social life and love life, and you're popular and you're part of a sorority and a fraternity, if you feel good, if you feel happy, if your life is thriving, I think you'd be much less likely to participate in any campus protest.
Yeah, I mean, look. I mean, we are no question that there can be all sorts of personal discontent that becomes transmuted into political ideology. Yeah, I mean, and that was these frat boys. Like, they felt themselves to be we are like the victors in life. I mean, regardless of how their life was going on, that particular moment, they understand themselves to be part of a kind of a thriving group, which is, because they're thriving, is going to be targeted um, by the resentment of the less happy, the less thriving, the less well off. That Yeah, that's why they take that side. I mean, of course, I mean, that's the entire Nietzschean theory of the genesis of morality, that all originates in some kind of resentment, and that all of our modern ideals of dignity and equality are ultimately products of resentment on some level that sort of developed historically. But I think that, even if that's the case, I think, like, I mean, today, uh, given that our culture has been shaped by thousands of years of Judeo-Christianity, believing in, you can believe in equality. You don't need to be driven by personal resentment to end up believing that. Just because these principles are so built into our culture anyways, that people are going to absorb them to various degrees, regardless of how thriving they are personally. But I would agree that that's certainly can be magnified by personal life resentments.
The more you have to lose, the less likely you'd participate in these protests. I mean, if you've got a wedding that's due in 3 months, if you're planning your wedding, if you're planning your career at Goldman Sachs, you've been accepted into Goldman Sachs. If
Yeah.
you're about to launch a career in merchant banking, if you've been accepted by a premier law school or medical school, if the status quo is treating you well, if you see a bright future for yourself, I just don't see very strong odds that you'd go out there and jeopardize the great things you've got going in your life by participating in protests that frequently turn lawless. On the other hand, if you don't feel like you've got your future mapped out in a way that's congenial to you, if you don't feel like you're winning from the current status quo, if you don't feel like your your direction in life, your rights are protected and safe, and that you're financially secure, those with the least to lose are going to be the most likely to be rambunctious in their protest. Those with the most to lose are going to be the least likely to protest. So I'm just kind of restating my point in new terms.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something to that. I think you can certainly find counterexamples too. I mean, certainly at Harvard soon after October 7th, you had certain statements made by various students, and I know that some law students lost offers at big law firms at Harvard Law School when they were outed for whatever outrageous thing they said. You had in Brooklyn during the George Floyd riots in 2020, you had a bunch of lawyers. I think they were in big law, but they were but they'd all gone to elite law schools who torched a police car, ended up going to jail. So I mean, you do have certain examples, right? I mean,
But
I
these were not white people who torched the police car. These were people who already felt on the margins of society. And yeah, there were reasons why they should have felt protective of what they had, but they still did not feel in the that they occupied the center ground in America.
That could be, yeah. I mean, that could be that even if objectively they did in terms of their credentials and so forth, you could say, yeah, maybe given their general background, they had this gnawing sense of socially coerced inferiority, even if they, personally were not marked by that. Yeah, I think that's plausible.
Okay, so a few weeks ago, I sent you a lecture. It's called The Craft of Writing Effectively. It was by the former director of the University of Chicago's writing program, Larry McInerney. And it made me think of your memoir about your time at Stanford University, and how you had this fellowship to create what's become conservative claims of cultural oppression. And you deliberately chose not to follow the code. And so one of the
Yes.
points that Larry McInerney makes in this talk is that every group has a code. And if you want to affect this group and you want to succeed with this group, you have to speak their code. And you deliberately flouted the code. Do you have any reaction to this?
Well, yeah, I mean, guilty as charged. I mean, yeah, I was living with my own code, which the problem with personal codes, beyond them just being personal, is that that because you are generating it yourself, it's very hard to even get to the point where you can even defend it to others. Even assuming that they're able to be persuaded. I didn't even have the persuasive capacity to persuade them that, yeah, there are delays and it's not exactly what you were expecting, but believe me, it's going somewhere, because the fact is that it was just this latent conviction. As I write in the book, even after an entire year, even though I got there was some positive feedback in the end. What I had going into the hiring season in 2009 was still pretty crappy. Even though it became the stuff that you've read, but yeah. So it's you are the primary obstacle uh to disregarding the code. It's not primarily, I don't even think, the dogmatism there, though that's certainly there. It's the problem of the challenge of getting to the point where you can truly be articulate about what you're trying to do and actually defend yourself. And the more autonomous you aim to be, the harder it is to get to that point. And because I was not at that point by the time I would have had to be, even to have a any kind of chance of prevailing. So they saw me as a rapscallion of some kind, who had taken advantage of them, which wasn't my intent, but is the natural reading of things. So the code, it's not the code is yeah, it is people's beliefs, but it's also just the general structure, which at each point prevents people from rising to the point where they can proffer any kind of half convincing alternative.
Okay, so the name of his talk is The Craft of Writing Effectively. And he says the question that we have to ask is whether your community of readers is going to value what you write. And value lies in your readers, not in the thing itself. So, how people think about their writing without thinking about readers is the biggest challenge you face. So, did you think about your readers when you were crafting your conservative claims of cultural oppression, and to what extent did you accommodate your readers?
Very little. Very little. I mean, obviously, when you're writing, you are thinking about being read on some level. That's implicit in the project. It's not like you can disconnect yourself from that, but it's very easy to idealize your reader into, whatever you would like your reader to be, and to think, well, okay, well, maybe this is not going to jive with them instinctively, but that's their problem. They've got to, eventually they'll see what I'm trying to do, which is the case for a few, has been the case with some people certainly. Uh, but yeah, you're over idealizing them. At least I did, because I couldn't ignore the idea that I have readers. But yeah, I also kind of I implicitly demanded more trust that I should have expected they would be willing to give. So the reader is there, but the writer can create his own image of the reader in their mind. And well, unfortunately, I mean, as you're gonna crash your head against the wall, the hard wall of reality at some point, when come to see that they're not exactly who you wanted them to be.
So Larry McInerney defines knowledge this way. Most people think of a positivistic world where knowledge accumulates, it just builds over time. And whenever you find out something that people didn't know, you just get to add to this model. And so knowledge keeps on
Right.
growing and everybody's happy. That does seem to match your perception. His claim is knowledge is a conversation that moves through time, and there's a bunch of people and they get to say what knowledge is. That there's not so much a bunch, but a small number of people who essentially get to say what knowledge is, and you want to be able to participate in their conversation if you want to appeal to the people who control what knowledge is in your field. So were you looking at your work as an accumulation of knowledge, or were you looking at it as knowledge is a conversation moving through time and a small number of people essentially get to say what knowledge is in a particular area?
Well, I mean, as a matter of empirical fact, in terms of power, you know, um, certainly people. There's a small group of people who do get to decide socially what knowledge is. So even my book, Conservative Claims of Cultural Oppression, even if what I have now, if I have what I have now had been ready, um had been ready then. I mean, let's put it this way: what I've written by now, I think, is much better than anything I could have written uh long ago, when I was still trying to make my way through the system. But the fact that right now I'm outside the system, so it doesn't really matter what its subjective or even objective quality is, whatever that means. If you are outside the matrix of power, then you have a problem. So I'm I don't discount the idea that, yeah, there are there's this group of people, um and they have the power to credential. And if you can't avail yourself of that power, the characteristics of your writing don't matter all that much. Um, so that's a hard, sad truth, which I've certainly come to feel. I've never the idea of accumulation, the steady accumulation of knowledge. Everybody's doing their small bit. I certainly, I mean that may certainly be a good model for certain fields. I always felt that in the humanities, where you're trying to articulate something about human nature afresh, um, that model gradual accumulation doesn't I don't think it really does justice to what is required to generate insight in humanities and philosophy. I don't I never felt at home with that model, even though that is accepting that model is the very minimum prerequisite for success in academia. That is true. It never resonated with me though.
So Larry McInerney says in this lecture, if you think that you are here to do original work, and he's talking to graduate students, if you would find the synapse in your brain that is storing those words, kill it. You are here to do valuable work, not original work. What is the difference? And so the difference is you need to state what the conventional wisdom is in your field and then add to it or challenge it. So you use words like nonetheless, widely accepted, however, although, inconsistent, reported, anomaly. So you look for these, you look to summarize the conventional wisdom in your field, and then you add to it, or you challenge it, or you point out an inconsistency, or you reconcile something that hasn't been reconciled. And so he says, here's my first piece of advice to make your writing better for graduate students. Spend 15 minutes a week for the rest of the year. Take articles in your field, print them out, go through and circle every word in the writing that is creating value to your readers. And so what do you think about these ideas?
That's nothing I could ever do temperamentally.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, on a general level, sure, I want to, every academic wants to challenge, conventional thinking on a certain level. And obviously that presupposes some acquaintance with what the conventional thinking is. But my mind, the way my mind works, it operates, much more chaotically than is suggested by the model you describe. My feelings that you want to be systematic. At the end of the day, you want a certain order that others can relate to. But if the risks of this very methodical approach recommended by this guy, I think I guess that's sort of the romantic counter enlightenment person in me. I think you risk snuffing out a lot of creative juices by seeing yourself as this like mechanic who's going in there. Okay, what's going on? What can be improved? It's efficient, but I think it damages uh, certain features of our intellectual capacity to become that regimented and systematic in our approach to thought. And of course that's what happened over the fellowship. I mean, I was very unsystematic and only got more so, and I was not able to bring myself back into that more organized fold by the time I had to. So that's kind of the tragedy of the fellowship. I've tried to do that since, but I would not. For me, I would not start the way he recommends. I think that should be the end goal, but the end goal should not be translated into these very regimented procedures. So I think there's something unique in each mind and in each human mind, and you need to remain you're interacting with this field, but you need to remain attuned to what you distinctively have to offer.
What if the reward was a tenure track position at a top 20 law school if you simply followed this code for your
Yeah,
thesis?
well, I mean, I wouldn't begrudge anybody who thought that way. I was just temperamentally unable to.
But what if you we're often able to do things when we see the reward? So what if you'd seen the reward of a tenure track position in a top 20 university? Would you have been willing to give this code an attempt?
Maybe I think I'm going to proffer one explanation, and I don't know, how true. I mean, I think it's somewhat true, at least, is that I think probably by the time I got to Stanford, I had been set in my ways from philosophy. I I felt I'd been beaten down in philosophy so much. I don't know that I even though they told me, oh yeah, you could get this kind of job. There's almost something in me that maybe didn't quite believe it anyways. And if that's anyone, maybe that's self-defeating, but I think it was there. And so if that's kind of how you're feeling on some level, maybe you're just going to say, well, I have no chance with this conventional route. So even if that's not justified, so I may as well, give this unconventional approach a chance, even if the chances are probability of success are low. Maybe it's the only thing I can do. So I think I was possessed of that kind of instinct.
So if this guy had been at Stanford University, he'd heard about your struggles and he tried to stage an intervention with you and said, Rony, come see me. And he says,
Right.
Rony, you're doing such valuable work, but you're simply not submitting to the code that works for what you're trying to achieve. Do you think you could have heard that at all, or you would have just
I don't know. I
shut it
mean,
out?
we don't. I mean, that's in a sense what Joe and Barbara were kind of
Yes.
saying, more or less. So it's not a hypothetical. I mean, they tried to have their intervention, and I kind of write about that. I mean, look, I look back and I say, I mean, yeah, could I have acted? I mean, in retrospect, maybe we, character is destiny. We think we have free will. We think we make decisions based on rational considerations, but maybe we have our character that sort of drives us in a certain direction, and that's kind of how it looks to me in retrospect. I mean, if I could have suspended all those instincts for for a few years, that's sort of the conventional wisdom. Just get tenure, then you're free, then you can do other things, or even just get a job. Yeah, maybe I'd be happier today than I am. That's definitely possible. But I continue looking back. There was something in me that was driving me towards something like the things you've read. And while following this advice you've described, it might have gotten me a job. I guess it would not have yielded the Star Chamber or conservative claims of cultural oppression. That would have been sacrificed, and would have been worth it. Well, had I done it, I'd be a different person today than I am. So it's kind of hard for me to compare these things even.
Well, would you recommend to a young person in the position that you were in to try to give this conventional approach their best efforts?
Yeah, I would. I think I mean, if they find that they might find that it sucks all the life out of them, as many academics do, including some who leave voluntarily. Maybe they got a job, they got tenure, but they're just they're depressed, devitalized by the culture. But if you're not one of those persons, and you're not meaning that you can discipline yourself in that way, then yeah, you should certainly give it a shot, because you're already taking big risks, making huge sacrifices, going down the academic route. I mean, you could be the model academic and still just have the bad luck of not getting a job anywhere.
Right.
That's
There are no
certainly
guarantees in life.
possible.
There are no guarantees in life, but obviously there are more effective and less effective ways of doing things. And I think what Larry McInerney is outlining is that for most people, this is who are graduate students who want a career in the academy, this is a
Yeah,
more effective technique. So
yeah,
perhaps when I look at his speech here and I've taken excerpts of it, it seems to be a really good summary of what Joe and Barbara were trying to say to you, which was, Ronnie, in your work here, you need to communicate to your readers, dear reader, you are smart, you have contributed, you have advanced this community in
yeah,
fabulous ways. There's this little thing here that you have gotten wrong. And
yeah.
then they will say, well, thank you, Ronnie. Thank you for appreciating our good work. Now, what do you think we have wrong? And then you have an argument, as
Right.
opposed to Joe and Barbara might have looked at your work in progress and said, Ronnie, this is what you're saying. I've read all your stuff, dear reader, and you're idiots.
Yeah, I mean, you can certainly have that feeling. I mean, and certainly, I mean, academics have sensitive egos, and one of the ways is to ingratiate yourself to them is like this full and robust acknowledgement of their contributions, and even if you don't, identify them specifically, they certainly want to see that you're deferential towards the kind of people they are, even if they individually have nothing to do with it. Um, but I would think that, yeah, I mean, yeah, there's certain arrogance. I mean, I think if you want to do something that's different and original, you have to be arrogant on a certain level, and some people are definitely going to be put off by that. I've never held out the Star Chamber as a guidebook for success in academia. In fact, in the preface, I expressly describe it as a case study in what not to do. So I've never sought to universalize it, but just to use it as a means for laying things out. Yeah, and I was just in a special uh, set of circumstances, maybe constraints created by my own character. So be it. For what it's worth, whatever lessons can be drawn from it. That's what I have to say. But yeah, I would say maybe you can learn some things from this. But yeah, I would not adopt it as a modus operandi, and certainly academia is full of risks even under the best of circumstances. So I mean, you're definitely better off playing conservative.
And
No,
so
no question.
this is more from Larry McInerney's famous speech. He says the University of Chicago writing program is not popular in the world of writing programs, and you can see why. People think we're fascists because here's what we teach people to do. We say, identify the people with power in your community and
Mhm.
give them what they want.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, I'm not gonna. I could moralize it and say I wouldn't sell out, but I'm not. I'm not gonna moralize it. It's not a question of superior moral virtue. It's a question of yeah, intellectual disposition. Maybe there's something kind of obstreperous and rambunctious and provocative in me that I want to say, well, I don't have to play the game, and I didn't have to, but I suffered the consequences. That's
And
true.
yeah, Larry adds, so are you telling me that you want me to go to this important person, the editors of this journal, and tell them that they are wrong? Yes, I do want you to do that, but I need you to do it under the code. You want to do it under the code. There are polite ways of telling important people that they are wrong. There are polite
Right.
ways to do it. There are insulting ways to do it. I want you to do it the polite way. That's what he's urging.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, well, that's something that I stress in the Star Chamber. That certainly, there's this idea. Liberal defenders of the modern university will say, well, before the 1960s, colleges were just basically finishing schools, right? For the elites, yeah, they learned some things, they read the classics, but it was really about how to how to behave. It was more a code of etiquette and social positioning more than anything else. They'd be like, now when the 1960s generation took over, they changed it. All the baby boomers are like, now we're gonna, we're based on merit, we're based on intellectual virtues. It's not your connections, but it's your SAT, and we're much more rigorous now. And that isn't true, because these norms of politeness are still built into the academic enterprise itself. They're not genteel, country club wasps on the outside anymore. But that is still built, and maybe even more so, built into the academic norms themselves. The way you present questions, the way you frame relevance, the way you position yourself relative to other academics, explicitly or implicitly. So we're still the finishing school. The code of politeness, that's still a big part of the academic enterprise, but it's not at all acknowledged. At least formally it was acknowledged. This is about transforming you into a certain kind of person who can productively participate in a certain kind of social morality. And I think that is that aspect is still there, but it's subtler and not really acknowledged.
And even outside of the academy, if you want to succeed, you identify people with power to help
Yeah.
you, and you give them what they want. That's a pretty good model for success in life.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, and I'm trying to go that way now, when I'm writing these essays, I'm trying to like bridge that gap. I'm trying to, yeah, I have these instincts which I honed through my writing, but I can't go to somebody who has power, uh who doesn't know me at all. And I can't like throw my 700-page conservative claims of cultural oppression on their desk and say, read it, and you'll see how great I am. Let me work for you or whatever. Like, that's not going to happen. But yeah, I can maybe write an article that's going to appeal to them on some level and get my foot in the door. That way. The fellowship was supposed to be how I got my foot in the door. I got one foot in the door and then took it back out.
Yeah. Okay, I gotta run. Do you have any
Okay.
final words?
That's it. But yeah, we'll do this again soon. So have fun.